The county thought the new barrier would save the land, and for one bright season it looked like they were right, because the most dangerous systems in the world usually arrive looking clean, efficient, and overdue. What failed that spring was not just a fence. It was a way of thinking, the habit of solving living problems with dead materials, of mistaking speed for wisdom, of believing the earth can be controlled by anything that has never had to grow. In the spring of 1994, trucks rolled into Harrow Creek, a farming district stretched along the slopes above a narrow Tennessee River basin where every hard rain turned gravity into a thief. The company was called TerraSafe, and its salesman brought dark green polymer erosion barriers that promised long life, easy installation, and engineered protection for vulnerable hillsides. He set up outside the co-op with diagrams, samples, and the kind of confidence that makes people feel late to the future. By the end of the week, farmers all over the ridge had bought in. The barriers were straight, durable, modern. They could be installed in a day. Compared to rotting posts, sagging wire, and endless repairs, they felt like progress. So the lines went up across the slopes, along pasture edges, above drainage runs, across the very ground that always suffered first when storms settled in. From the road, the whole district looked upgraded. The one person who did not buy was Ruth Holloway. She was 63, quiet, exacting, and known for noticing things other people only saw after they became expensive. She farmed 146 acres above Miller Branch, land she had inherited from her mother and kept together through droughts, bad markets, and years when banks treated caution like weakness. She raised hay, corn on the flatter ground, and a modest cattle herd, and she kept a spiral notebook full of rainfall totals, planting dates, and observations about how water moved after every storm. While her neighbors drove posts and stretched synthetic barriers across their slopes, Ruth spent 3 cold mornings laying out a curved planting line that followed the way runoff actually traveled. Then she planted willow, dogwood, hedge apple, hawthorn, and switchgrass in staggered rows along the contour above the branch. The plants were small. The line looked irregular and low. To most people, it looked like nothing. A neighbor slowed beside her truck and asked what exactly she thought those sticks were going to stop. Ruth told him, "I'm not building to stop water. I'm building to teach it to slow down." He laughed because it sounded poetic, and poetry is not what most people want from erosion control. But Ruth was not guessing. For years she had studied an old overgrown hedge line behind one of her hayfields, a rough strip of thorn, grass, and rooted disorder planted generations earlier and mostly ignored by everyone except her. She had watched that living line hold through wet years that cut scars into nearby banks. She had seen sediment settle behind it, soil stay put above it, and moisture linger longer in dry summers. She understood something the brochures never mentioned: land is not protected by what sits on top of it. It is protected by what joins it from below. Nobody wanted that answer because it came with an inconvenient price: time. The synthetic barriers looked effective immediately, and that is how weak systems earn trust. Ruth's planting looked foolish in its first year. Knee-high shrubs. Thin willow rods. Grass plugs barely visible unless you knew where to look. But underground, the work had already begun. Willows reached for seepage. Dogwood spread dense roots where the first vulnerable inches of soil tend to shear away. Hedge apple pushed deeper, building long-term structure. Switchgrass stitched the surface together with a fibrous net. Through 2 summers and 2 winters, while the barrier systems still looked cleaner and more impressive from the road, Ruth's line was turning from a row of plants into a mechanism. She bent flexible branches sideways to increase density at the base rather than height at the top. She was not making a wall. Walls concentrate force. She was building drag, roughness, interruption, a living edge that could take moving water and make it spend itself in fragments. That distinction stayed invisible because what mattered most was hidden underground. By the 3rd year, her contour line had thickened enough to register from a distance. By the 4th, it had become a dense seam across the slope, feathered with grass on the downhill side and rooted deeply enough that the soil itself had changed character. It held moisture better in summer, drained better in wet weather, and felt darker, looser, more alive. The neighboring polymer barriers also still looked successful, which is why people kept believing in them. But their weakness was already built in. They interrupted water without transforming it. They trapped debris. They forced flow to concentrate at weak points. They depended on the surrounding soil remaining stable while doing almost nothing to make that soil more stable. Ruth's system was becoming the soil. The proof came in May of 1998 when a stalled weather system parked over western Tennessee and refused to move. Rain fell Thursday night, then Friday, then through the dark into Saturday morning. The branch at the basin floor rose early. Wheel ruts filled. Water began standing in places that normally dried by noon. By Saturday, the lower meadows were flooded, but the real damage was happening on the slopes where speed and angle turn water into a cutting tool. On the Bledsoe Place, cornstalks and sticks jammed against one stretch of TerraSafe barrier during the night. Water hit that trapped debris, built pressure, and forced itself toward the nearest gap. It began tunneling on the downhill side. Soil gave way. A post tilted. Then the entire section released at once, mesh and mud twisting downslope in a single violent peel. What remained was not a neat opening but a gouged chute spilling brown water through exposed pale clay. On other farms the same logic played out with slight variations. Where barriers held longer, they often failed worse, because they had more time to collect debris and build force. Where they crossed subtle swales, they turned sheet flow into channels. Where runoff should have spread, it accelerated. The systems were not failing because they were cheaply made. They were failing because they were solid where they needed to be porous, rigid where they needed to adapt, and anchored to soil they did nothing to strengthen. By mid-morning, farmers were standing in rain gear at field edges watching years of accumulated fertility leave in minutes. Topsoil that had taken generations to build was moving downslope toward the basin, to settle somewhere useless. Across Harrow Creek, pale subsoil showed through in strips and scars. Then someone looked toward Ruth Holloway's property. Her contour line, now 4 seasons old, ran dark across the slope above Miller Branch. Rainwater came off the upper field and met it, but instead of striking a hard edge, it met friction. Grass caught sediment. Stems interrupted flow. Branches flexed. Water spread along the contour instead of punching through it. Some passed between plants. Some soaked downward into soil made more porous by roots, microbes, and organic matter. The root mass below the line transformed speed into residence time. That was the hidden system. Not magic. Not nostalgia. Residence time. Slow the water and you change the outcome. Break one violent force into 1,000 smaller movements and the hill keeps itself. Ruth's slope got saturated, but it did not unravel. Her field below the contour remained intact. Not dry. Not untouched. Intact. One neighbor crossed over to look more closely and found the soil above her line rough and holding, not planed off and running. Fine sediment had settled behind the grass fringe instead of escaping. The ground yielded slightly underfoot, then held. That was the difference. Not hardness. Structure. By noon, 5 neighboring farmers were on Ruth's porch, dripping rainwater and trying to find language for what they had just seen. One finally said, "Your line is holding." Ruth nodded. Another asked, "How did you know?" She told them the truth. "I didn't know this storm. I knew what water does when it gets concentrated, and I knew what roots do when you give them time." Then she put on her coat and walked them out to the slope. She showed them the contour itself, curved with the land instead of slicing across it for neatness. She pointed to the switchgrass holding surface soil, the willows rooting into the wettest sections, the dense branch lattice that slowed flow without damming it. She knelt and pressed her palm into saturated ground at the base of the planting. The soil was wet, but firm with life underneath. "A post holds until the dirt around it lets go," she said. "Roots hold because after a while, they are the dirt." Nobody answered right away. The storm moved on by Sunday, and the full damage revealed itself only after the water dropped. Some farms lost deep sections of topsoil along concentrated channels. Others lost shallower layers across enough acreage to reduce yields for years. Once exposed clay appears on a working hillside, everyone understands what has happened even if nobody says it aloud. This is not a seasonal setback. This is time stolen. Recovery, if it comes, will take years, even decades. Ruth's field told the opposite story. Sediment had accumulated where it could be spread and kept. Moisture lingered where roots had slowed it. The slope was still whole. That was when the district began to understand why the best systems stay hidden until a crisis reveals them. Their mechanisms are underground. Their rewards arrive as absences: the soil that did not leave, the field that did not fail, the damage that never happened. A product can be photographed on day one. A living system often looks like failure in its first season. That is why people ignore it. Not because the information is unavailable, but because patience is harder to market than performance. In the weeks after the storm, neighbors came to walk Ruth's line. Some came openly. Some just slowed their trucks on the road. Even the salesman returned with revised language about drainage compatibility, but polished language sounds thin after land has already made its decision. By autumn, several farmers began planting their own living contours. Not decorative hedges. Systems. Willow where seepage lingered. Dogwood for shallow binding. Hedge apple and hawthorn for structure. Switchgrass for stitching the vulnerable surface. Ruth walked their slopes with them and showed them where water confessed its path if you watched carefully enough. She explained that species diversity was not sentiment. It was resilience. Storms do not test every plant the same way, and a monoculture defense is still a monoculture. The results unfolded slowly, which is to say they unfolded in the only timeframe land respects. Within a few years, the new contour lines were already trapping sediment, softening runoff, holding moisture longer into summer, and turning fragile hillsides into something harder to injure quickly. Birds returned to the edges. Soil darkened. Small wash channels faded. The change was not dramatic at first. It was cumulative. That is how real systems work. They do not dazzle you up front. They quietly reduce the number of things that have to go perfectly for your future to survive. Years later, one torn section of failed polymer mesh still hung in a neighbor's equipment shed, too damaged to reuse and too instructive to throw away. He kept it there, he said, to remember the price of wanting tomorrow's answer today. Ruth's original contour line kept growing. Underground, roots deepened, fungi spread, organic matter built, and the slope above Miller Branch became not invincible, because nothing is, but vastly harder to break in a single bad weekend. That is the lesson Harrow Creek learned too late for one storm and just in time for the next. The strongest protection is rarely the thing that looks strongest at first glance. It is the thing that has had time to enter the problem from the inside. In farming, in health, in money, in any part of life that can be broken by shock, convenience performs beautifully in mild weather. Structure reveals itself in the storm. When the next hard rain comes, the question is never whether you bought something impressive. The question is whether what protects you has had time to become part of the ground beneath you. On Ruth Holloway's slope, that answer had been growing quietly for years, until one storm made the invisible visible and showed the whole county a truth they could feel under their boots: what lasts is what learns the shape of the land from the inside.